Daniel Reed was not the kind of student who drew attention in the corridors of the University of Michigan. He was discreet, always dressed simply, almost unnoticeable amid the hectic flow of students moving from one class to another. That spring semester, Daniel was taking advanced calculus, a subject feared by many, taught by Linda Cartwright, a demanding professor known for quickly eliminating any student she deemed too weak. Daniel was well aware of this. He knew that every step taken inside that classroom was being watched, especially by people like Professor Whitaker, who always seemed to find reasons to doubt him even before he had uttered a word. That particular day, Cartwright's class was packed. Some visiting professors had appeared, further heightening the tension in the environment. Daniel sat at the back of the room, silent, as he copied the complex equations that Cartwright quickly scribbled on the blackboard. Despite his apparent calm, Daniel clearly perceived the suspicious and judgmental glances being thrown his way. It was nothing new to him. It bothered him, yes, but he had learned not to show weakness. And it was precisely at that moment, between one formula and another, that Daniel noticed something strange. Cartwright had made an error in the equation. A small error, but a fundamental one, and apparently no one else had noticed. Daniel stared at the error on the board for a few seconds, feeling a sudden tightness in his chest. It wasn't the fear of being wrong, but the pressure of that moment that caught him off guard. Correcting a professor was already risky. Correcting Linda Cartwright in front of such a hostile audience was almost an act of rebellion. He felt a pang of doubt about whether he should expose himself at all. After all, Cartwright was known precisely for never accepting public challenges. Many students had already tried to confront her before, but the results were always embarrassing, ending in public humiliation and resigned silence. Daniel discreetly looked around. His classmates continued copying blindly, and the visiting professors, especially Whitaker, smiled arrogantly, as if they were waiting for any slip-up to confirm their prejudices. Meanwhile, Cartwright continued explaining as if nothing were wrong, confident and relentless in her demeanor. Her voice echoed through the room with absolute conviction, and Daniel clearly noticed how she exuded authority. The boy gripped his pen between his fingers, feeling his hand sweat slightly. Inside him, an unsettling sensation began to grow, driven by something stronger than his initial apprehension, the absolute certainty that he could not ignore that mistake. After all, mathematics had always been more than cold calculations on paper to him. It was something almost intuitive, a language that seemed to speak directly to him. Ignoring that error would be to deny what he deeply believed in. Then, with a decisive impulse, he slowly raised his arm, waiting to catch the professor's attention. Daniel kept his hand raised for a few seconds, which seemed endless to him. Gradually, his classmates' eyes began to turn in his direction, surprised by that unexpected boldness. Cartwright's confident expression altered slightly when she realized that a student, and precisely that student, dared to interrupt her in front of the visitors. The professor shot him a piercing, almost threatening look before arching an eyebrow in silent challenge. In a firm and cold voice, she asked if Daniel had any doubts about what was being explained. It wasn't a real question, but an obvious trap, designed to put Daniel in the spotlight and intimidate him enough to back down. The students held their breath, expecting him to lower his arm, perhaps inventing some excuse to escape the pressure. But Daniel did not back down. Instead, he slowly stood from his chair, maintaining a firm posture despite trembling legs. With surprising calm, he politely informed the professor that there was an error in the equation written on the board. His words hung in the air, cutting and clear, echoing through the room in a silence so heavy that one could hear the accelerated breathing of some classmates. Cartwright maintained an ironic smile, clearly suspicious, and challenged Daniel with sarcasm, asking if he thought or was really sure about the error. Her tone suggested that he was about to commit a great mistake, opening the door to being humiliated in front of everyone present. Whitaker leaned forward in his chair, clearly amused by the situation, and the other visiting professors whispered among themselves, already anticipating the predictable outcome of the scene. Daniel felt the weight of those glances, laden with doubt and disdain, but he remained steadfast. Looking directly into Cartwright's eyes, he stated with absolute certainty that he was sure of what he was saying. His voice did not falter. It showed no insecurity or fear. This surprised the onlookers even more, as they began to realize something unexpected about this quiet young man they barely knew. Faced with this, the professor, visibly disturbed, decided to raise the stakes even further. With a theatrical gesture, she offered Daniel a piece of chalk and asked him to correct the alleged error on the blackboard in front of the attentive, judgmental gaze of the entire audience in the room. A heavy silence settled as Daniel slowly made his way to the blackboard. Every eye was fixed on him, scrutinizing each step, each movement, expecting to see him falter under the pressure. Cartwright handed him the chalk without another word, simply folding her arms in a clear gesture of defiance, confident that in a few moments she could prove that this student was nothing more than a bluff. Daniel's heart raced, but his expression remained serene, almost indifferent to the burden of negative expectations. Taking the chalk in his hands, he felt that he was not just correcting an equation, he was correcting something much deeper. He was correcting the distorted view these people held about him. Turning toward the board, Daniel took a deep breath, briefly closing his eyes to concentrate. The problem lay before him, clearly exposed, and it was obvious that no one else had noticed the mistake the professor had made. With an almost frightening clarity, his mind began to unravel the calculation, mentally reviewing each step before putting the chalk to the dark surface of the board. Then, without hesitation, Daniel corrected the error with confidence, drawing the numbers and symbols with surprising precision. The soft sound of chalk against the board echoed in the absolute silence of the room, intensifying the tension of the moment. Some students leaned in discreetly, trying to follow the logic of his reasoning, while the visiting professors exchanged discreet glances, visibly surprised by the firmness with which he conducted the explanation. When Daniel finished, he calmly turned to Cartwright, awaiting her evaluation. For a few moments, the professor simply stared at the board in absolute silence, trying to find some flaw in the presented solution, some detail that could invalidate what had just been witnessed. Her expression turned rigid, revealing a mixture of surprise and disbelief. She clearly had not expected that the timid student, discredited by many, would be capable of such precision under immense pressure. Whitaker, who until then had maintained a sneering smile, now stood motionless, speechless, looking at Daniel with a completely new expression, a mix of curiosity and caution. The rest of the class was also frozen, unable to react immediately, almost as if they still couldn't believe what they had seen. In that moment, even if subtly, the balance of power in that room had begun to change. Cartwright remained still for a few more seconds, staring fixedly at the blackboard, as if trying to process the scene she had just witnessed. The tension in the room was palpable, and the silence began to bother even the visitors who had initially been against Daniel. Finally, the professor broke that awkward silence with a brief, forced smile, like someone who recognized defeat but was unwilling to admit it. In a dry, controlled tone, she announced that Daniel was correct, but she did not express praise or admiration. On the contrary, she immediately decided to challenge him again by presenting on the board an even more complicated problem. It was a complex equation full of variables, something that even graduate students would take a long time to solve, especially under pressure. Her intention was clear. She wanted to make him stumble. Daniel felt the challenge, but this time something inside him was different. Instead of insecurity, he felt more focused, as if he had finally found his place in that hostile environment. Ignoring the murmurs that began to spread around the room, Daniel picked up the chalk once more, facing the board with absolute concentration. He did not show haste or nervousness. Instead, his hands moved with impressive assurance. Every number, every symbol he drew seemed to fit perfectly, flowing with impeccable logic. As he solved the equation, some students began to whisper in admiration, slowly recognizing that Daniel was not merely solving the problem, he was delivering a lesson, far clearer and more objective than the one Cartwright herself had given moments earlier. The speed and precision with which he tackled the challenge were impressive, generating murmurs of surprise and admiration. Whitaker no longer appeared as confident as he had minutes earlier. His eyes were fixed on the board, closely following every step taken by Daniel, almost as if desperately searching for a mistake to discredit him. But that mistake simply did not appear. When Daniel finished, he stepped back slightly and observed what he had done, mentally verifying the solution. The equation was perfect. No errors, no hesitations. This time, when he turned to face Cartwright, there was a subtle expression of pride on his face, but not arrogance. It was the serene look of someone who knew exactly what he had done and was at peace with the result. Daniel handed the chalk back to the professor, patiently awaiting her reaction. For the second time that day, Cartwright had been outdone by a student who, in her view, should not have been there. Linda Cartwright felt a growing frustration seize her. She had never experienced anything like this in her years of teaching. Students did not correct her, not in such a confident and sequential manner. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain the authoritative posture that was characteristic of her, but her eyes revealed a clear disturbance in the face of what had occurred. Determined to keep her image intact, Cartwright quickly took the chalk from Daniel's hands and, without saying a word, returned to the blackboard. This time, she chose an exercise reserved only for extreme occasions, a problem taken directly from an advanced book, one that few doctoral students could solve without assistance. With a challenging smile, she coldly announced that Daniel could try to solve it if he thought he was capable. Daniel observed the problem carefully, showing no sign of intimidation or insecurity. His eyes seemed to shine as he absorbed every detail of that seemingly indecipherable equation. The challenge that Cartwright had imposed, instead of frightening him, appeared to awaken in him something even more intense, a kind of quiet and genuine enthusiasm for mathematics that had accompanied him since childhood. Daniel was not there to prove anything to the professor, much less to those arrogant visitors. He was there for himself, and that gave him an extra strength that made him completely forget the hostile environment around him. He picked up the chalk again and, with quick and decisive movements, began to solve the complex problem. There was no hesitation, only absolute clarity, demonstrating a brilliant intelligence that was beginning to win the silent admiration of his classmates. Daniel continued to swiftly write the solution on the blackboard, and every movement reinforced the audience's astonishment. The expression on the visiting professors' faces shifted from mockery to confusion, and soon after to something akin to silent admiration. Even some classmates, previously apathetic or indifferent, had stopped copying altogether and were now following everything with absolute attention, clearly fascinated by the ability of that once overlooked quiet student. The atmosphere had changed. No one was rooting for Daniel's failure anymore. Instead, there was an anxious, almost collective expectation to witness just how far that unexpected demonstration of mathematical genius would go. Whitaker especially could no longer hide the discomfort on his face, realizing that his prejudiced certainties were being dismantled before his eyes. When Daniel finished solving the advanced problem, he stepped away from the board with the same simplicity with which he had begun. There was no arrogance in his posture, only a calm and respectful assurance. All the visiting professors looked on in surprise, commenting among themselves with confused expressions, clearly uncomfortable with having so blatantly underestimated the young man they had never taken seriously. Whitaker crossed his arms, visibly bothered by the unexpected situation. Meanwhile, Cartwright remained motionless, speechless, scrutinizing every detail written on the board, trying to find any flaw, however slight, to re-establish her control over the situation. But the more she examined Daniel's solution, the clearer it became to her and everyone present that there was no error to be found. The prolonged silence only made everything more embarrassing, especially for her. It was then that Cartwright, in an impulsive act, broke the silence abruptly, trying to reclaim her authority, but her voice revealed an unusual nervousness. Unable to completely contain her irritation, she declared that the true test of Daniel's ability was not in solving problems in the classroom, but in facing real challenges, such as official competitions where he would be tested on an equal footing against the best students in the country. With a smile that concealed the bitterness of the defeat she had just suffered, Cartwright announced in a challenging tone that Daniel should participate in the next National Mathematics Championship. It was a clear trap, and everyone knew it. Whitaker smiled again as if relieved that the professor had found another way to prove that Daniel did not belong there. But Daniel, looking calmly into Cartwright's eyes, simply nodded, immediately accepting the proposed challenge, surprising everyone in the room even more. Cartwright's announcement hung in the air like a strategic blow, a calculated move to strip Daniel of any credit he had earned that day. The room remained silent for a few moments, as if people were processing the audacity of the proposal. The National Mathematics Championship was not just an ordinary academic competition. It was a prestigious event where the best students in the country, many of whom had been trained from an early age by renowned mentors, competed in tests of extreme complexity. The idea that a student who was barely noticed by his own peers would compete against geniuses from institutions like MIT, Stanford, and Caltech seemed absurd to many. At that moment, whispers began to grow among the students, and disbelief was visible on the faces of some of the visiting professors. Whitaker managed a satisfied smile, as if he had regained the certainty that Daniel, no matter how brilliant, would eventually be put in his proper place. But Daniel did not hesitate. He did not ask how much time he would have to prepare, did not try to negotiate, and showed no sign of fear. He simply looked at Cartwright with the same serenity as before and said, in a direct and objective manner, that he accepted the challenge. The unexpected response plunged the entire room into an even heavier silence. No one had expected that. They expected hesitation, doubt, or that he would back down, but Daniel simply accepted, as if the pressure imposed by the professor had no effect on him. For a brief moment, Cartwright lost her expression of superiority. It was clear she had not anticipated such an immediate answer. Whitaker uncrossed his arms and frowned, clearly irritated by not seeing a trace of fear in Daniel's eyes. The other students exchanged looks, some surprised, others still incredulous. And it was at that moment that something began to change. Even those who had previously doubted Daniel were now curious. After all, who was that student that so many had ignored, yet now refused to be put down? The following days were marked by a constant buzz in the corridors of the University of Michigan. Daniel Reed's name, once ignored by almost everyone, was now frequently mentioned among students and professors. Some commented on his courage, others on his recklessness. But everyone agreed that he had become a figure impossible to ignore. Cartwright no longer made direct references to him in her classes, but something in her behavior had changed. If before she barely noticed his presence, now she seemed more rigid when speaking, more careful with her own calculations on the board, as if fearing another mistake in front of that student who had publicly challenged her. Whitaker, on the other hand, seemed to have regained some of his confidence. To him, Daniel had merely postponed the inevitable. In his view, the boy might have shined for a moment, but his true failure would come in front of the elite of academic mathematics at the championship. Daniel, however, did not worry about external opinions. While others debated his chances, he did what he always did, studied. But now, there was something different. Before, he studied because he loved mathematics, because numbers made sense in a world that often did not. Now he also studied because he wanted to prove that that moment was not a fluke, not luck, not for Cartwright, not for Whitaker, but for himself. He knew the competition would not be easy. His competitors were prodigies, trained from an early age by mentors who had believed in them from day one. Unlike them, Daniel had always had to prove his intelligence even before opening his mouth. He did not have the luxury of others' doubts. If he made a mistake, they wouldn't say he was having a bad day. They would say he should never have been there. But that certainty, far from frightening him, only motivated him more. Days turned into nights, and nights into quiet early morning study sessions. While many of his classmates rested after classes, Daniel immersed himself in books, solving increasingly complex problems. He mapped out a meticulous plan for his preparation, studying not only the traditional topics of the championship, but also exploring advanced mathematical techniques that might give him an edge. There was no coach, no support team. It was just him, a pile of notes, and his unwavering determination. In the breaks, some students who previously didn't even know his name now approached him, asking about the competition. Some encouraged him, others made comments disguised as curiosity but laced with doubt. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" one of them asked once. Daniel just smiled slightly and returned to his studies. He didn't need to answer with words. Cartwright, watching from afar, noticed that something at the university had changed. The students' attitudes, once indifferent, now seemed different. There was an expectation in the air, an energy she could not ignore. It was a silent discomfort, as if Daniel were gradually dismantling the invisible structures that had been accepted there for so long. Whitaker, on the other hand, avoided mentioning his name whenever possible. If before he treated him as someone irrelevant, now he deliberately ignored him, as if trying to minimize the importance of what was happening. But Daniel himself never sought validation. He was used to being underestimated, judged even before showing what he was capable of. Except that this time, he knew he would have a chance to show everyone what he had always known about himself, and that was enough. The day of the National Mathematics Championship finally arrived. The competition was being held at the University of Pennsylvania, and the campus buzzed with brilliant students from all over the country. The main auditorium where the test would take place was imposing, with row upon row of chairs filled with students who had spent years training for that moment. The atmosphere was one of maximum concentration, but also of silent rivalry. There was a mutual recognition among the competitors, an understanding that the best of the best were present. To many, Daniel was just an unknown face, a newcomer without a track record in the competition. But some had already heard rumors about what had happened at the University of Michigan, and that was enough to attract curious glances as soon as he entered the auditorium. Daniel walked to his table with firm steps, feeling the weight of every gaze upon him. Some participants whispered among themselves, scrutinizing him as if trying to decipher whether he truly belonged in that environment. A student from Stanford looked him over from head to toe before giving a half-smile of disdain and returning his focus to his own preparations. To them, he was nothing more than an underdog, someone who would soon be crushed by the complexity of the questions. But Daniel did not care. He took a deep breath, opened his notebook, and mentally reviewed everything he had studied in recent weeks. Around him, other competitors frantically checked their notes, murmured formulas, or closed their eyes trying to concentrate. He, on the other hand, remained calm. At that moment, he knew that it no longer mattered where he came from or what was expected of him. What really mattered was what he would do there, in that exam. The clock struck exactly 9 o'clock when the organizers distributed the tests. The tension in the room increased instantly. The competitors' eyes scanned the pages filled with complex equations, problems that demanded an extreme level of logical reasoning and mathematical precision. It was the kind of test designed not just to assess knowledge, but to separate those who truly belonged to the academic elite from those who merely believed they did. Daniel took his paper calmly, quickly scanned the questions, and felt a silent surge of adrenaline course through his body. There was no time for hesitation. His pencil met the paper and began to move almost immediately. Around him, the other competitors entered a state of absolute concentration, some biting their lips, others frowning at the complexity of the exam. The more experienced ones, those who had competed for years, knew that every second counted. But what caught the attention of the judges watching the room was the way Daniel wrote. He did not hesitate. He did not stop to reevaluate each step like the others. His calculations flowed with an almost frightening clarity, as if each answer had already been formed in his mind before even being written. One of the professors monitoring the competition leaned in slightly to observe his paper, curious about the speed at which he was progressing. In just a few minutes, Daniel was 2 or 3 questions ahead of most of the participants. Time seemed to pass differently for Daniel. While other competitors began to stretch, sink into their chairs, as if the weight of the questions was becoming unbearable, Daniel appeared to be in a state of total flow. He did not get distracted. He did not look at the others. His focus was absolute, and mathematics simply made sense. Every equation, every variable fit naturally in his mind. As time passed, Daniel solved more questions than most, yet without haste. He knew it was not about speed, but about precision. Suddenly, the final question appeared before him, a monumental problem, the kind of challenge that could turn the tide for any competitor. It was an equation with multiple variables, a real mathematical puzzle that required not only skill, but creativity to solve. Daniel looked at the problem calmly, observing its complexities and nuances. The room was in complete silence, except for the sound of pencils scratching on paper. He took a deep breath and, without hesitation, began to write, his hands moving with impressive fluidity. Every movement seemed planned. Every line he drew was in harmony with the final answer. The faces of the other competitors reflected growing tension. Some began to despair, exchanging nervous glances, while Daniel remained serene. Time seemed to have no dominion over him, as if he were operating on a different rhythm. When he finished writing, the final line was clearly marked on the paper. He was in no hurry to hand in his test. On the contrary, he gave one last look at the pages, quickly reviewing his answers, and then, confidently, handed the paper to the judges. When the competition ended and the judges began reviewing the tests, the room was still filled with the sound of held breaths. Daniel moved away from his table, but did not rush. The atmosphere was tense, with all the participants anxiously watching for the results. Sweat began to appear on some competitors' foreheads, and the atmosphere, once charged with confidence, had become dense, a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Daniel sat down, but his posture was calm, as if he already knew what was coming next. He did not need anyone's approval. Deep down, he knew that the work he had done there spoke for itself. It was then that the chief judge approached, with a serious and attentive expression. He held the tests in his hands, and as he passed by the competitors, he looked at each one with precise focus. When he reached Daniel, the examiner paused for a moment. His gaze fixed on the boy's answers, and the seconds that passed seemed like an eternity. Finally, he lifted his eyes and turned to the other judges. Something was clearly wrong. After a brief exchange of words, the chief judge returned to the stage, where the audience waited impatiently for the conclusion. With a slight smile, he picked up the microphone and, in front of everyone, announced the winner of the competition. Daniel Reed, the young man from Michigan, had won. The reaction was immediate. The auditorium erupted in applause and cheers. The other competitors, who had previously looked at Daniel with disdain or indifference, were now astonished. Daniel, for his part, did not make a fuss about celebrating. He stood up calmly, gave a brief smile, and accepted the trophy with the same serenity he had shown during the test. There was no glory in his expression, only the satisfaction of knowing that the impossible had been achieved. The surprised look on Whitaker's face, who was in the audience, was unmistakable. He could no longer deny the truth. Daniel had proven something much deeper than any calculation. He had broken a barrier that many considered insurmountable. When Daniel returned to his seat, the buzz of disbelief and admiration around him began to dissipate, but he was not concerned with the glances. He knew he had achieved something far more significant than any medal or prize. It wasn't about the victory itself, but about what that victory represented. The overcoming of all the expectations imposed on him, the shattering of the stereotypes that had always tried to define his place. While the other students continued processing what had just happened, Daniel looked at the trophy in his hands with a slight expression of respect. For him, it wasn't an end, but a reflection of what he knew he was capable of. He would need no further validation. He had already validated himself. The judges eventually began to disperse, and the audience slowly calmed down. But the scene was far from forgotten. The competition was over. but the impact Daniel had made in that auditorium would reverberate for a long time. Cartwright, who had once publicly challenged Daniel, now stood silent, with an expression that no one knew how to interpret. The woman known for her inflexibility seemed unable to speak or act, as if what had just occurred had dismantled the rigid fortress she had built over the years. While she tried to process what had happened, Daniel got up without haste and headed backstage. Whitaker watched everything with growing tension. He, who had previously laughed at the young student, was now mute, almost unrecognizable. The idea that Daniel, with his history of challenges and overcoming obstacles, had anything left to prove at that moment had dissipated. Daniel had already proven everything he needed, and the truth was simple and undeniable. He hadn't just defeated the best in the competition. He had defeated the expectations that society, academia, and even those around him had imposed on him. Back in Michigan, the reaction at the university was a mixture of surprise and silence. Daniel Reed's name was already circulating through the corridors, but it was a strange kind of recognition. Some professors, like Cartwright, still tried to convince themselves that his victory was an exception, a fluke of nature, an accident that would soon be forgotten. However, it wasn't long before the truth spread like wildfire. Daniel was not an exception. He had defeated the system, broken the chains of doubt and mistrust that surrounded him. More than just a prize, he had earned a place in the world of mathematics where no one could ever put him back. The atmosphere in the classes changed. When Cartwright began her next lesson, she did not mention the championship. But there was something different in her demeanor. Upon seeing Daniel in the room, she paused, a rare occurrence for someone as meticulous and controlling as she was. Her eyes briefly passed over him, and in that moment, a subtle change filled the air. She didn't need to say a word. Everyone in the room knew that something had changed, and there was no longer any space for prejudice or disdain. Daniel sat down with the same calm as before, without flaunting his victory, without making a spectacle of his success. He simply opened his notebook and continued to study, as he always did. He didn't need recognition. He had already earned it. Whitaker, however, was not prepared to accept defeat so easily. In the following weeks, he tried to get in touch with Daniel, offering him opportunities and advice, perhaps seeking somehow to redeem himself or even to understand what had happened there. But Daniel was already beyond that. He knew that his journey was not about pleasing or proving anything to anyone. He didn't need validators for his talent, nor did he need redemption for those who had doubted him. The only validation that mattered was the one he had earned within himself, and no one could take that away from him. In the classroom, the respect his peers had for Daniel grew, but he didn't seem to care. He knew that throughout his life he would always be challenged to prove he deserved the place he had earned, whether in mathematics or any other field. But at that moment, he had achieved what mattered most, the certainty of his own worth. He had spent his entire life trying to fit into a world that often seemed unprepared to accept his presence. However, Daniel now understood one fundamental thing. He no longer needed to mold himself to be accepted. He wasn't there to ask anyone for permission. He was there because he had every right to be. And so over time, Daniel Reed's story began to be told in a different way. Not as the Michigan kid who challenged mathematics, but as an example of perseverance, confidence, and intelligence that everyone, without exception, should take as inspiration. He was not just the winner of a competition. He was a symbol of resistance against the barriers that society tries to build. There were no grand celebrations or applause at the end. Daniel knew that his mission was not to seek recognition, but to give the world his best. And that he had already done. The impact of his victory extended far beyond the university. Other students from various fields of study began to see Daniel's mathematics as a reflection of what they too could achieve. He had proven, through his actions, that it didn't matter where you came from or what the world said about you. The only thing that truly mattered was what you believed you could accomplish. And when Daniel looked to the future, he knew there was still much to be conquered, but that did not worry him. He knew that the greatest challenge had already been overcome, proving to himself and the world that he was, in fact, a mathematical genius. In his post-competition journey, Daniel was invited to speak at various institutions and even at some academic forums, but he always declined. What he wanted most was to continue his work quietly, without the weight of external expectations on his shoulders. He knew that by accepting those invitations, he would only be fueling the narrative of a winner who needed to be applauded. But Daniel was not interested in that. Above all, he wanted to be remembered for his contribution to the world of mathematics, not for the trophies he had won. His true passion had never been about being recognized, but about solving problems, understanding the unknown, and pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. The impact of his victory reverberated, however, far beyond the walls of the university. Some of his classmates began to rethink their own beliefs about what it meant to be a good student or a good mathematician. Daniel was not just a genius who had all the right answers. He was someone who showed that human potential knew no bounds, and that the fight against prejudice and stereotypes was a constant battle. He did not allow himself to be defined by labels, and that lesson for many was more transformative than any solved equation. And that is how Daniel Reed, with his simplicity and sharp intelligence, proved to everyone what he had always known: that the greatest challenge was not winning a competition, but rather defying the expectations imposed by society and showing through his actions that true genius has no color, class, or origin. It resides in those who believe in their own potential, regardless of the obstacles the world puts in their path. Deep down, he knew that his journey was only just beginning. In the last class of advanced calculus that semester, Cartwright began her explanation in her usual manner, but something was different in the room. She knew that Daniel's presence there meant more than just mathematics. It was the silent acknowledgement that he was not merely a student, but a symbol. She glanced at him as she wrote on the board. To many, he was still the same quiet young man, but to her, he represented the fragility of what she had believed the meritocratic system to be. She didn't need to say another word. The tension that once dominated the environment had dissipated. Her classmates' eyes were now on him, not with suspicion, but with silent admiration. At the end of the class, unexpectedly, Cartwright paused her explanation and looked directly at Daniel. She recognized him, not only for his mathematical intelligence, but for the transformation he had caused in everyone around him. With a slight lightness that was almost imperceptible to the others, she declared aloud, "Daniel Reed has proven that talent has no color." The room fell into complete silence, but the message was clear. Daniel's victory had not been just a stroke of genius against a closed and prejudiced system. It was a victory of dignity and self-sufficiency. Daniel needed nothing more. He did not rise or bow to express gratitude. He simply did what he always did, opened his notebook and continued to study, as if that recognition was no more important than mathematics itself. He wasn't there to confirm anyone's opinions about what he could or could not achieve. He knew exactly what he had accomplished. Respect, not because of his color or origin, but because of his talent, which spoke louder than any judgment. And when Daniel Reed finally looked up, he knew that his true mission had been fulfilled. It didn't matter if the world understood or not. He had proven to himself what he had always known. He did not need the validation of others.